The single notification vibration on the polished mahogany conference table sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence of the campaign headquarters. A solitary image had just been delivered to the encrypted group chat labeled Sterling Inner Circle, a chat restricted to exactly 6 people who controlled the political fate of this state. My mother, Victoria, reached for her phone with a bored elegance, expecting a polling update or a donor confirmation. But the moment her eyes locked onto the screen, the crystal champagne flute in her other hand shattered against the floor. My name is Evelyn Miller, though until 4 hours ago, the world knew me as Evelyn Sterling, the pristine, polished daughter of Senator Arthur Sterling. I am 26 years old, a Stanford graduate, and to my parents, I was supposed to be the ultimate political prop, a silent, smiling guarantee of family values and dynastic continuity. Instead, I am the woman who just burned their meticulously curated legacy to the ground with a single photograph sent from the back of a dusty aircraft hangar. Today was my wedding day, an event that should have been the society highlight of the season, featured in every glossy magazine from DC to Los Angeles. But the pews of the small chapel were filled with mechanics, pilots, and waitresses, not senators and lobbyists. My father, the Honorable Arthur Sterling, and my mother, the terrifyingly perfect Victoria, were conspicuously absent. They did not send a gift. They did not send a card. Instead, at 8 o'clock this morning, a courier arrived at the apartment I share with my now husband, Jack, and handed me a thick envelope containing a cease and desist order. It was a legal threat drafted by the family's top firm, explicitly forbidding me from using the surname Sterling in any professional or public capacity alongside the name Miller. To them, the name Miller, an occupational surname for a common grain grinder, was a stain. It represented labor, sweat, and the working class, everything the Sterling brand of silver spoon aristocracy was built to look down upon. They believed that by stripping me of their name, they were punishing me, cutting me off from the source of their power. They had no idea that I had already severed the connection myself and that I was holding a weapon far more dangerous than a last name. I looked at my husband, Jack, standing by the open hangar doors where our reception was in full swing. He was loosening his tie, grease already faintly staining his cuffs because he had stopped to fix a generator that was acting up. He laughed at something his best man said, his face open and honest, a stark contrast to the frozen masks I grew up around. Jack is a mechanic. He fixes things. He makes things fly. To my parents, he is the help. To me, he is the only real thing I have ever known. Standing next to Jack was his best man, Daniel West. Daniel is quiet, unassuming, and lives in a trailer near the airfield. He wears clothes that have been mended 3 times over and keeps his head down. But today, in a cheap rented suit that was a size too big for his broad shoulders, Daniel looked terrifying. Not because he was dangerous, but because of his face. He has the same steel gray eyes as my father. He has the same sharp aristocratic jawline. If you put a black and white filter on him, he is the spitting image of Senator Arthur Sterling from his first campaign posters 30 years ago. That was the photo I sent to the group chat. It was a selfie of the 3 of us, me in my simple white dress, Jack with his crooked smile, and Daniel standing between us, looking directly into the lens with those haunting, familiar eyes. I didn't add a caption. I didn't need to. Back at the campaign headquarters, the panic was instantaneous and absolute. My phone, which had been silent for weeks as they gave me the cold shoulder, lit up with a call from my mother. I declined it. Then a call from my father's chief of staff, declined. Then my father himself. I watched the screen pulse with his name, Senator Sterling, and felt a cold, hard satisfaction settle in my chest. They weren't panicking because I had married a mechanic. A rebellious daughter marrying beneath her station is a story they could spin. They would paint me as a romantic but troubled girl, and Jack as a gold digger. They could handle a scandal, but they could not handle a ghost. Daniel West is the walking, breathing proof of the Sterling family's original sin. He is the glitch in their perfect software. My parents have spent millions of dollars and 3 decades erasing the existence of my father's twin brother, Thomas, a man they cast aside because he wasn't perfect enough for the dynasty. They thought Thomas died in poverty and obscurity, taking his secrets with him. They had no idea he had a son. They had no idea that his son was my husband's best friend. And they certainly had no idea that I knew the truth. I looked around the hangar. It smelled of aviation fuel, cheap beer, and barbecue smoke. It was loud and chaotic, and completely lacking in the pretension that suffocated Sterling Manor. My sister, Caroline, would have hated it here. In fact, I knew she was probably already drafting a statement about how concerned the family was for my mental health. Caroline was the golden child now. the one who married a hedge fund manager and drove a car that cost more than Jack's entire business. She was the keeper of the image, the one who frantically smoothed over the cracks. But cracks turn into canyons if you ignore them long enough. I walked over to the corner of the hangar where I had stashed my bag. Inside, beneath my change of clothes and toiletries, was an old wooden box. It was made of cedar, the varnish worn down at the corners, smelling faintly of old paper and dust. I had stolen this box from the false bottom of a bookshelf in the Sterling Manor Library when I was 15 years old. At the time, I was just a snooping teenager looking for old diaries or maybe some cash. What I found inside terrified me into silence for a decade. I ran my fingers over the lid of the box. Inside were the documents that proved everything. The birth certificates, the trust fund ledgers, the letters from a private sanitarium. The evidence that $50 million of my father's self-made fortune was actually stolen from the brother he erased. My phone buzzed again. A text message from my mother this time. "Answer the phone, Evelyn. We can fix this. Just tell us what you want." I smiled at the screen. Fix this. That was the Sterling motto. Anything could be fixed if you threw enough money or lawyers at it. They thought this was a negotiation. They thought I was holding Daniel hostage for a payout, or maybe looking for an apology so I could be welcomed back into the fold. They didn't understand that I didn't want their money, and I certainly didn't want their acceptance. I typed a reply, my thumbs hovering over the glass screen. "I don't want anything. I just wanted to share my happiness. Daniel says hello." I hit send. Across the room, Daniel caught my eye. He raised his plastic cup in a silent toast, his expression calm. He didn't know the full extent of what was in the box, not yet. He just knew that for the first time in his life, he wasn't hiding. He didn't know he was the rightful heir to an empire built on his father's bones. He just knew he was the best man at a wedding for two people who loved him. I looked at the cease and desist letter still sitting on the passenger seat of my car parked outside. They wanted to protect the name Sterling from being tarnished by association with us. It was almost funny. By the time I was done with them, the name Sterling wouldn't mean silver or quality or purity. It would mean fraud. My father's face appeared on the giant television screen mounted above the hangar's bar, a muted news segment about his upcoming re-election gala. He looked confident, regal, the very picture of American success. The chyron beneath him read, "Senator Sterling, a legacy of integrity." I looked from the screen to Daniel, then back to the box in my bag. "Enjoy the integrity while it lasts, Dad," I whispered to myself. The phone in my hand started ringing again. It was the family's crisis management attorney this time, a man named Marcus Thorne who was known for burying bodies, legally speaking. I let it ring. Let them sweat. Let them wonder how much I knew. Let them stare at Daniel's face in that photograph and realize that the past they buried was coming for them, and it was driving a beat-up truck and wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit. The music in the hangar swelled, a slow song for the bride and groom. Jack walked over and took my hand, his palm rough and warm against mine. "You okay?" he asked, noticing me staring at the phone. "They giving you trouble?"
"No trouble," I said, slipping the phone into my pocket and turning my back on the vibration. "Just fan mail." I rested my head on his shoulder as we began to sway, but my eyes stayed open, fixed on the exit sign glowing red in the distance. The war had officially started. They had fired the first shot by trying to erase my name. I had just fired back by showing them a face they couldn't erase. Tomorrow, they would try to destroy us. They would try to buy us. They would try to threaten us. But tonight, we danced. And in the morning, I would open the box. 15 years ago, the silence of the Sterling Manor Library was the only thing I trusted. I was 11 years old, hiding from a fundraising gala that had overrun the lower floors, curled up in the crawl space behind a false panel in the mahogany bookshelves. My father used this room for off-the-record meetings, assuming a child wouldn't understand the muffled conversations about redistricting and hush money. But that night, I wasn't listening. I was looking. I found the loose floorboard purely by accident, prying it up to hide a stash of candy. Instead, I found the cedar box. Inside wasn't money or gold. It was a life. There was a black and white photograph dated 40 years prior. Two boys, identical down to the cowlick in their hair, stood on the manor lawn. One was my father, Arthur. The other was labeled Thomas. Beneath the photo was a birth certificate for Thomas Edward Sterling, born 12 minutes after Arthur. And beneath that, a medical file from a sanitarium in upstate New York. The diagnosis wasn't insanity. It was a severe, stress-induced stutter. In the Sterling dynasty, perfection was the currency. A senator needed a voice that could command rooms, not one that stumbled over vowels. So Thomas was erased. He was sent away, cut out of the photos, and eventually cut out of the family entirely. But the most damning document in the box wasn't the medical file, it was the financial ledger. Grandfather Sterling had been cruel, but he wasn't heartless. He had established an irrevocable trust for Thomas, a safety net of $50 million to ensure his exiled son lived in comfort. I sat on the floor of the hangar, the wedding music thumping in the distance, and opened the digital files on my tablet. I didn't just have the old box anymore. 6 months ago, before my parents realized I was defecting to the commoners, I used my clearance as the campaign's director of strategy to access the family's deepest archives. I ran a forensic audit on Trust B. The money was gone. Every single cent of Thomas's $50 million had been siphoned out over 3 decades. It hadn't been lost in bad investments. It was systematically drained to fund Arthur Sterling's rise to power. My father's first Senate run, paid for by Thomas. The renovation of the manor, Thomas. The hush money for the lobbyist scandal in the 90s, Thomas. They had stolen his birthright to build their brand, leaving Thomas to die in a state-run facility, penniless and alone. And they left his son Daniel to grow up in foster care, believing his father was a nobody. I looked up from the tablet as the sound of an aggressive engine cut through the celebratory noise of the hangar. The heavy bay doors were still open to the airfield night, and a pristine white Mercedes S-Class sedan rolled onto the concrete floor, its LED headlights blinding the guests. The music died instantly. Caroline stepped out of the car like she was stepping onto a red carpet, not an oil-stained floor. She was wearing a silk jumpsuit that cost more than the Cessna parked behind her, and her face was twisted in a look of absolute revulsion. She didn't come alone. 2 of the family's private security guards flanked her, looking uncomfortable in their suits amidst the smell of aviation fuel. "This is cute," Caroline announced, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. She kicked a stray wrench with the toe of her Louboutin. "Really, Evelyn? I thought the rebellion phase ended in college, but playing house with grease monkeys in a tin shed, this is a new low even for you." Jack stepped forward, wiping his hands on a rag, his jaw set. "You're trespassing, Caroline. Get out." Caroline laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "I'm not here for you, mechanic. I'm here to save my sister before she does something irreversible. Do you have any idea what that photo did? Mom is hyperventilating."
The press is already asking who the mystery man is. She turned her glare on me. "Evelyn, get in the car. We are going to issue a statement that you were hacked, that this is a deep fake, and you are going to come home and apologize." I stood up, not needing to wipe my hands. "I'm not going anywhere, Carolyn, and it's not a deep fake. It's a pathetic attempt to hurt Dad," she spat, stepping closer, invading my space. "You found some look-alike actor to play a part? It's tacky, it's desperate, and it's going to cost you your trust fund, your status, everything. Look at these people," she gestured vaguely at the wedding guests. "They aren't your family. They are nobodies. You are a Sterling. Act like it." From the shadows behind the tool benches, a figure moved. "She is acting like it," a voice said. It was deep, resonant, and possessed the exact timbre of Senator Sterling's voice from the Senate floor. Caroline froze. She knew that voice. She had heard it giving toasts her entire life. She turned slowly. Daniel stepped into the light. He wasn't trying to be intimidating. He was just standing there, holding a half-empty beer, wearing his ill-fitting suit. But the lighting in the hangar caught the angles of his face, the high cheekbones, the heavy brow, the steel-gray eyes that were the genetic trademark of our line. Caroline's face went from arrogance to pure, unadulterated terror. She stumbled back, actually reaching out to grab the door of her Mercedes for support. It was one thing to see a photo on a phone screen. It was another to see the family ghost staring you down from 10 feet away. That's not possible," she whispered. "Thomas is dead." "Thomas is," I said, stepping up beside Daniel. "This is his son. His name is Daniel West, and according to the documents I have in my bag, he is the rightful owner of the $50 million Dad used to buy your car, your house, and his Senate seat." Daniel looked at me, confused. "50 million? Eve, what are you talking about?" I put a hand on his arm. "I'll explain later." I looked back at my sister. "Caroline, go home. Tell Mom and Dad the ghost isn't going away. Tell them he's hungry." Caroline looked at Daniel, then at me, then at the security guards who were looking nervously at the identical features of the man in the cheap suit. The illusion of control she had walked in with was shattered. She scrambled into the driver's seat, nearly slamming the door on her coat, and reversed out of the hangar so fast her tires screeched on the concrete. The silence she left behind was heavy. Jack walked over to Daniel and clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You okay, buddy?" Daniel looked at the retreating taillights. "No," I said softly. "She looked at you like you were a consequence." An hour later, as the party was winding down and the reality of what I had just done began to settle in,
A black town car pulled up to the edge of the hangar. It didn't drive in. A courier in a dark suit walked up to me and handed me a heavy, cream-colored envelope with the Sterling family crest embossed in gold wax on the back. I opened it. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a threat. It was a handwritten note from my father. Evelyn, we need to talk. Not as politicians, but as family. Bring the boy. Dinner at the manor, tomorrow, 7 o'clock. Let's settle this. I showed the note to Jack. He read it and frowned. It's a trap. Of course it's a trap, I said, watching the town car drive away into the darkness. But they don't realize I'm the one who set the snares. I turned to Daniel. How do you feel about meeting your uncle? Daniel looked at the photo of his father I had finally shown him, the twin brother erased from history. His expression hardened, the confusion replaced by a cold resolve that looked terrifyingly like my father's. I think, Daniel said, I have a few questions for him. The wrought iron gates of Sterling Manor groaned open, admitting Jack's battered truck onto the pristine gravel driveway that I used to ride my ponies down. The estate loomed against the night sky, a sprawling limestone fortress lit by uplights that cost more per month to run than most families earned in a year. In the passenger seat, Jack gripped the dashboard, his knuckles white. In the back, Daniel stared out the window at the life that should have been his face a mask of quiet, terrifying calm. We didn't knock.
The heavy oak doors swung open as we approached, revealed not by a butler, but by my mother, Victoria. She stood in the foyer like an ice sculpture wrapped in cashmere, her eyes scanning Daniel's face with a mixture of horror and calculation. She didn't say hello. She didn't look at me. She simply turned on her heel and walked toward the dining room, the click of her heels echoing the command to follow. The dining room was set for a negotiation, not a meal. The 20-foot mahogany table was bare except for a pitcher of water, a stack of legal documents, and my father, Senator Arthur Sterling. He sat at the head, rigid and imposing, wearing his Senate floor suit. When Daniel walked in, my father flinched. It was subtle, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of the eyelids, but I saw it. He was looking at a ghost of himself, 30 years younger, and wearing a mechanic's suit. Sit, Arthur commanded, gesturing to the 3 chairs positioned like an inquisition bench opposite him. We sat. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Victoria slid a single, crisp check across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of Daniel. $2 million, Victoria said, her voice devoid of inflection. Tax-free. The funds are routed through a shell corporation in the Caymans, untraceable. Daniel looked at the check, then up at them. For what? Arthur leaned forward, his steel-gray eyes locking onto his nephew's. For a new life, somewhere else, South America, perhaps, or Eastern Europe, and for a procedure. He slid a glossy brochure across the table. It was for a reconstructive surgery clinic in Switzerland specializing in facial modification. You have an unfortunate likeness, Arthur said coldly. It confuses the brand. We are willing to pay to correct that mistake. You disappear, you change the face, and you never speak the name Sterling again. He turned his gaze to me. And for you, Evelyn, the terms are simpler. An immediate annulment of this marriage. You return to the campaign trail as the dutiful daughter. We spin this week as a temporary mental health crisis brought on by wedding stress. I looked at the brochure, then at the check. It was grotesque. They weren't just asking him to leave. They were asking him to mutilate himself to protect their poll numbers. And if we refuse, Jack asked, his voice low and dangerous. Then we destroy you, Arthur said, leaning back. We bury you in litigation. We have zoning inspectors condemn your hangar. We have the IRS audit your business every year for the next decade. We make you toxic. My brother was a mistake, a genetic stutter in our line. I erased him to save this family. Do you think I will hesitate to erase a mechanic and a rebellious daughter? The Sterling brand is worth more than blood, Victoria added, quoting the family motto she had probably whispered to herself in the mirror for 30 years. I felt Jack tense beside me, ready to fight, but I placed a hand on his knee. This wasn't a fist fight, it was a chess match, and they had just exposed their king. I reached out and picked up the check. My parents watched me, triumph flickering in their eyes. They thought they had won. They thought everyone had a price. I ripped the check in half, then in quarters. I let the pieces flutter down onto the mahogany table. No, I said. Arthur's face turned a shade of purple I remembered from my childhood tantrums. You hold no cards here, Evelyn. You are cut off. You are nothing with this name. I am the director of strategy, I said, calmly.
Or I was. And I know your numbers, Dad. I know you are pulling within the margin of error in 3 key districts. I know the family man narrative is the only thing keeping you afloat against the challenger. If I walk away now, if I go to the press with the story that you skipped your own daughter's wedding, you lose. Arthur froze. He knew I was right. So here's the counteroffer, I said, leaning in. I don't want your money. I don't want your acceptance. I want unity, for the sake of the campaign. Victoria narrowed her eyes. What are you proposing? The re-election gala is in 48 hours. Live television. The biggest night of the cycle. I will attend. I will stand by your side. I will play the part of the loving daughter, and we will present a united front to the cameras. We squash the rumors of a rift right there on stage. And the mechanic.
Arthur sneered, looking at Jack. Jack stays backstage, I lied smoothly. But I have one condition. To truly honor the family history, to show the voters that we value our roots, I want to introduce a special guest during the tribute segment. Someone who represents the resilience of the Sterling line. My parents exchanged a look. They were arrogant, and their arrogance made them blind. They assumed I meant a distant cousin, or perhaps a symbolic gesture, maybe even Jack, cleaned up and silent, to show their benevolence to the working class. They never imagined I would bring the weapon they had just tried to buy off. A special guest, Arthur mused. Brief, no speeches, just a wave. Just a wave, I promised, and in exchange, you leave Jack's business alone. You leave Daniel alone, and after the election, we go our separate ways. Arthur studied me for a long moment. He saw the daughter he raised, the political operator, the strategist. He didn't see the woman who had spent the last 6 months digging up his graveyard. He thought I was folding to save my husband's business. Fine, Arthur said, standing up to signal the dismissal. But if you pull a stunt, Evelyn, if you embarrass me, there will be nowhere on earth you can hide. I understand, I said, standing up. I extended my hand. My father took it. His grip was firm, cold, and entirely devoid of affection. It felt like shaking hands with a corpse. See you at the gala, I said. We walked out of the manor in silence. We didn't speak until we were back in the truck, the heavy gates closing behind us, locking the monsters back in their castle. You're insane, Daniel whispered from the back seat. You're going to put me on that stage. I'm going to put the truth on that stage, I corrected, watching the manor disappear in the rearview mirror. They want a legacy? I'm going to give them one they'll never forget. I pulled my phone out and sent a text to my old assistant, who still thought I was loyal. Prepare the visual assets for the gala tribute. I'm sending over a secure folder. File name, The Truth. Do not open until I give the signal. The trap was set. They had opened the door. Now, all I had to do was walk in and light the match. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a sea of black ties, sequined gowns, and the heavy, suffocating scent of expensive lilies. 500 of the state's most powerful people, donors, lobbyists, and national press, sat in rapt attention as my father, Senator Arthur Sterling, stood at the podium. He looked every inch the statesman, silver hair perfectly coiffed, jaws set in determination, speaking with the cadence of a man who believed his own myths. Family, Arthur boomed, his voice echoing through the surround sound system. It is the bedrock of our nation. It is the compass that guides us. And tonight, despite the rumors, despite the noise, I am proud to stand here and tell you that the Sterling family is stronger than ever. He turned to the wings of the stage, extending a hand toward me. Please welcome my daughter, my strategist, and my heart, Evelyn Sterling. The applause was polite but hesitant. The rumors of my defecting to the commoners had been swirling for days. I walked onto the stage wearing a midnight blue gown that my mother had selected to project contrition and class. I smiled the smile I had been trained to wear since I was 3 years old. I took my father's hand. His grip was wet with sweat. He pulled me into a hug that looked warm to the cameras but felt like a vice. Do not screw this up, Evelyn, he hissed in my ear, barely moving his lips. I pulled back, beaming at him. Don't worry, Dad. I'm just here to introduce the special guest. I moved to the podium. The lights were blinding, white hotspots that erased the audience and left me alone with the microphone. I adjusted the stand. I looked into the teleprompter, which scrolled the speech my mother had written, a groveling apology about wedding stress and renewed loyalty. I ignored it. My father speaks often of legacy, I began, my voice steady, amplified across the room. He tells you that character is what you do when no one is watching. He tells you that the Sterling name is synonymous with integrity. I paused. The room was silent. In the front row, my mother, Victoria, stiffened. She sensed the shift in tone. But I have learned that a legacy isn't what you build, I said, leaning into the mic. It is what you hide. And tonight, I think it is time we stopped hiding. I pulled a small remote clicker from the podium shelf. I had swapped it with the AV Text standard clicker 10 minutes ago. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, please welcome the true face of the Sterling legacy. My cousin,
the son of the brother my father erased to build this empire. I pointed to the stage left entrance. Daniel West walked out. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing his mechanic's work suit, clean but undeniably blue collar, with the name Daniel stitched over the pocket. He walked to the center of the stage and stood next to my father. The gasp that ripped through the ballroom was physical. It sucked the air out of the room. Standing side by side, the resemblance wasn't just familial, it was terrifying. Daniel was the mirror image of Arthur Sterling, stripped of the polish and the expensive suit. The same steel gray eyes, the same nose, the same jaw. It looked as if the senator's soul had stepped out of his body. "Who is that?" someone shouted from the press pool. I clicked the remote. The massive LED screens behind us, which had been displaying the American flag, flashed black. Then a document filled the 40-foot display. It was the birth certificate of Thomas Edward Sterling, twin brother of Arthur. I clicked again. A black and white photo of the two boys, Arthur and Thomas, holding hands on the manor lawn appeared. 30 years ago, I narrated, over the rising murmur of the crowd, my father had a twin brother named Thomas. Thomas had a stutter. He wasn't perfect. So the family erased him. They institutionalized him. They told the world he died. "Cut the feed!" Victoria screamed from the front row, standing up and knocking over her chair. "Cut the mic, now!" But I had locked the system. The booth wasn't responding. I clicked again. The screen shifted to a forensic accounting spreadsheet. Red lines zigzagged across the display, highlighting massive wire transfers. "This is the ledger for the Thomas Sterling Irrevocable Trust," I said, reading the numbers loud and clear. $50 million. Money meant to care for a discarded brother. Instead, it was funneled into the campaign war chest of Arthur Sterling. I turned to my father. He was frozen, staring at the screen, his face the color of ash. He looked small. "The renovation of the manor?" I asked, pointing to a line item on the screen. "Stolen. The hush money for the lobbyist scandal of '98? Stolen. Even the suit you are wearing right now, Dad, paid for with money robbed from a man you left to die alone." The flashes from the press cameras were going off like a strobe light now, a blinding, chaotic storm. Donors were standing up, whispering, pointing. The narrative of the self-made man was disintegrating in real time, replaced by the image of a thief standing next to his victim. Victoria was clawing her way toward the stage stairs, shouting for security, but the guards were hesitant. They were looking at Daniel. They were looking at the screens. They were realizing that the checks that paid them might bounce. "This is a lie," Arthur finally croaked, grabbing his own microphone. "This is a deep fake, a political hit job." I clicked the remote one last time. A video played. It was grainy footage from the facility where Thomas died. He was old, frail, but he looked exactly like Arthur. He was holding a picture of a baby. On the back of the photo, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was the name Daniel. "That is your brother, Dad," I said softly. "And this?" I gestured to Daniel, standing stoic and silent in his mechanic's jumpsuit. "This is his son, the nephew you tried to bribe with $2 million last night to cut up his face so he wouldn't look like you." The crowd turned on a dime. The horror was palpable. The bribe was the final nail. Arthur looked at Daniel. For the first time, he couldn't look away. The guilt, buried under 30 years of ambition, clawed its way to the surface. He slumped against the podium, defeated not by an opponent, but by his own reflection. The room went dead silent, waiting. Daniel stepped up to the microphone. He didn't look angry. He didn't look like he wanted revenge. He looked tired. He looked at the man who had stolen his life, his father's life, and his name. "I don't want the money," Daniel said, his voice deep and steady, carrying to the back of the room, without a tremor. "I don't want the house."
I don't want the Senate seat. He looked out at the sea of shocked faces, then turned to Arthur. "I just want my name." He took a step back, turned, and walked off the stage. I placed the remote on the podium next to my father's trembling hand. "Legacy secured," I whispered. I turned and followed Daniel into the wings, leaving the Sterling dynasty burning under the hot white lights of their own stage. 6 months after the gala, I stood on the tarmac outside the hangar, watching the orange glow of the setting sun reflect off the sleek aluminum of a newly restored P-51 Mustang.
The air still smelled of aviation fuel and sagebrush, but the tension that had suffocated me for my entire adult life was gone, replaced by the rhythmic hum of impact wrenches and laughter. Inside the hangar office, a small television was playing the evening news on mute. The chyron at the bottom of the screen flashed a headline that had become familiar over the last half year. Former Senator Arthur Sterling indicted on 12 counts of embezzlement and wire fraud. The fall of the House of Sterling hadn't been a slide, it had been a cliff dive. The forensic evidence I released that night was undeniable. The Federal Election Commission and the IRS had moved in like vultures before the gala guests had even finished their dessert. My father, the man who once believed he was untouchable, was now currently out on bail, confined to a rented condo on the outskirts of the city, awaiting a trial that would almost certainly end in a federal prison cell. My mother, Victoria, had fared no better. The social circle she had curated with the precision of a surgeon had exiled her like a tumor. The charity boards, the country clubs, the gala committees, they all sent polite letters accepting her resignations. Last I heard, she spent her days with the curtains drawn, refusing to answer the door for process servers. And Caroline? My sister, who had sneered at grease monkeys, was currently trying to rebrand herself as a victim on social media, but the internet has a long memory. Her husband's hedge fund had quietly distanced itself from the Sterling name, and her black cart had been declined at Saks Fifth Avenue 3 months ago. I turned away from the TV and looked at the man working on the landing gear of the Mustang. Daniel West wiped a smudge of grease from his cheek, the cheek that still mirrored my father's, though the resemblance no longer terrified anyone. It just commanded respect. The civil suit had been settled 3 weeks ago. The court found that Arthur Sterling had breached his fiduciary duty for 30 years. The judgment was brutal and absolute. The judge awarded Daniel the full principal of the stolen trust plus compounded interest and punitive damages. The total came to $62 million. Daniel didn't buy a mansion. He didn't buy a yacht. He didn't even buy a new car. He still drove the same beat-up truck. What he did do was invest $10 million into Miller Aviation, making him a silent partner in Jack's business. He bought the land surrounding the airfield to ensure no developers could ever push us out. And he set up a scholarship fund for kids aging out of the foster system, kids like he had been. Jack walked out of the hangar carrying 2 cold beers. He handed one to Daniel and one to me, then wrapped his arm around my waist. He didn't look like a mechanic who had married a rich girl anymore. He looked like the co-owner of the premier restoration shop on the West Coast, standing next to his wife. "Are you ready?" Jack asked, nodding toward the fire pit we had built near the runway. "I'm ready," I said. I walked over to my bag and pulled out the cedar box, the same box I had stolen from the library wall when I was 15. It felt lighter now, empty of the secrets that had given it weight. I had already given the original documents to the FBI. I didn't need the birth certificates or the photos anymore. The truth wasn't hidden in a box. It was walking around the hangar, signing checks, and fixing planes. I walked to the fire pit where a small blaze was already crackling against the desert chill. I held the box over the flames for a moment, tracing the Sterling family crest stamped into the wood one last time. It stood for silver. It stood for purity. But as I looked at it now, all I saw was a hollow shell. "Legacy," I whispered. I dropped the box into the fire. The dry cedar caught instantly.
The varnish hissed and bubbled, the wood curling as the flames consumed the false history of my family. I watched it burn until it was nothing but gray ash, indistinguishable from the wood of a common pine. I turned back to the 2 men standing by the plane, Jack, my husband, and Daniel, my cousin. They were laughing about something, their faces illuminated by the firelight. They didn't have titles, they didn't have a dynasty, but they had honor. I wasn't Evelyn Sterling anymore. The courts had finalized my name change last week. I was Evelyn Miller. I had been disinherited, disowned, and stripped of every privilege I was born with. And I had never been richer. The rough hands of a mechanic and the quiet dignity of an outcast had built something my father never could, a life based on truth. As the last embers of the Sterling legacy floated up into the night sky, I took a sip of my cheap beer and smiled. Some bridges you burn to light the way. If you enjoyed this story of a dynasty crumbling under the weight of its own lies, hit that like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, would you have taken the $2 million bribe, or would you have burned it all down for the truth? Until next time.